Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Lunch with Books. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. I'm going to need a little more enthusiasm on the third good afternoon. We have to practice. Okay, we'll do that next time. Please turn off your cell phones if you have one, or put on vibrate or whatever. Nothing worse than a cell phone interruption, people. Let me take my mask off. Okay, before I introduce our guest, we just have to say happy birthday to our videographer. So, one second. I'll let him tell you how many. I'm not going to announce that. But here we go. We have balloons, and we have a card. He's been our videographer for many years. Yodeling Dick Brooks. So if you want to sign the card, if you haven't yet, we have one, and Aaron will get it around to you. Happy birthday, Dick. All right. Next Tuesday, Canal Coal Oil Days, a novel. It's another one from WVU Press. It was written by this gentleman's great-grandfather who's coming to visit us from Michigan, named Edward Watts. The grandfather's name was Theophile. That's a good old name. Theophile Maher. And he wrote a book about life in a coal town prior to statehood. So it involves West Virginia statehood and many other themes. Then in 2 weeks, brace yourselves, the West Liberty University African Drum and Dance Ensemble, directed by Mitch Greco, will be here to present traditional West African drum and dance. So wear something comfortable. You will be expected to participate, I have been told. I will not participate because I'm the host. Okay, from Aerosmith to ZZ Top, Richard Cobb, gentleman here, saw them all during his 25-year career managing mid-market. You can see on the screen the Charleston Civic Center. He tells stories about eating Fig Newtons with Elvis, imagine that, in his private airplane, and many others. This book they brought with them, We Were Legends in Our Own Minds, is a backstage pass to all these musical adventures. Now, the speaker today, you're familiar with, has been here a couple of times. Taylor Seaton is a freelance journalist and figurative sculptor, born and raised in West Virginia, a graduate of Marshall University. She has, I believe, 3 novels. Father's Troubles was nominated for Forward Magazine Book of the Year. Amo Amas Amat, an unconventional love story, and Hippie Homesteaders, which she spoke about here, as well as a nonfiction book about Ken Heckler called The Rebel in the Red Jeep, which she also spoke about here. Here's Taylor Seaton.
Thank you so much. The other thing that Sean did not mention is that I just happened to be Richard Cobb's wife of 20-some years. So that's how this book came about. Once upon a time, probably 20 years ago, we were at a Christmas party at my daughter's house, and my 2 sons who were there had been to concerts at the Civic Center in Charleston, where Richard used to call himself their babysitter. And so they started deciding that they would do a kind of a round-robin contest to see who could name the most acts that they'd seen. And I said, Tony, who suggested it, you don't want to do that because Richard's going to beat you. No, he said, I'm not. No, I've been to more. So, of course, we went around the room, and guess who won? Richard Cobb, because he had been the director of civic centers all across the country by then and had seen them all. So I continued to pester him after he would tell some of these stories to friends. Anytime we'd been in a gathering, somehow we'd get around to what did you used to do, and he would tell them, and then they would want to know a story. So I said, Richard, we need to write these down. I mean, come on, this is a book. People will want to know about this. No, nobody wants to hear about this. And I said, yes, they do, trust me. So I bugged him and bugged him and bugged him, and eventually, after a number of years, Richard has started to lose some of his short-term memory. So I said, now is the time. If we don't do it now, we'll never do it. So he finally agreed after I said, okay, I know a title. The title is We Are Legends in Our Own Minds, meaning not just the acts, but also directors of civic centers like Richard and promoters. So he finally said, okay. So he would dictate the stories to me, although he told many of them to me for years and years, and I pretty much had memorized them. So I started writing down his stories. And the story starts in the early 70s, way early 70s, when he was the accounts payable supervisor for the Diamond department store. If anybody remembers the Diamond, it's a long time ago. And he was in the Lions Club. And as a hobby, sort of, he used to organize the social events for the Lions Club. And it happened that the manager of the city then, whose name was Hugh Bosley, was also a member and a friend of Richard's. And Richard heard that he was going to, at that time he was the director of the Civic Center, and he heard that he was going to become the city manager. And so he said to Hugh, when I leave, who's going to take over the Civic Center? And Hugh said, you want it, you've got it. So it's the right place, the right time, the right person. So he became, at that time, the assistant to the Charleston Civic Center, which is what it looked like back then. If you've been to Charleston recently, you know it looks a whole lot different. And at the time, it seated about 10,000 people. So he, the nice thing about that, they called that a mid-market facility, but they had promoters with national shows and several others who used to book to see all of these acts. So the first act that he had to deal with was when he was still the assistant manager, and it was Sly and the Family Stone. Now, Sly had a really bad reputation for bringing drugs into the building, smuggled into his guitar case, and Richard knew all of this. But the problem that Richard had with Sly was that he couldn't get him to come out of the dressing room. He was in there for over an hour and a half after the opening act had done their thing, and they kept stomping and clapping and stomping and clapping. And Richard said to his dad, you've got to get this guy out of there and onto the stage. So they go up to his dressing room, and his daddy says, Sly, they're ready for you. And he goes, that's not the question, Daddy. The question is, am I ready for them? And he would not come out of the dressing room. He was in there doing drugs. And finally, got him on stage. Then they couldn't get him off. And then after that, they had a big party, and they couldn't get him out of the building. So Richard started drawing up different kinds of contracts. They had to say when they came to what time they had to be in the building, what time they had to be on stage, what time they had to be off stage, and when they had to be out of the building. And that became an industry standard for a long time for Sly Stone, because he was so hard to deal with. Eventually, Sly mellowed, and they took those kinds of clauses out of his contract, and he became a very mellow person eventually. The next act he had to deal with was Black Oak, Arkansas. This is good old Jim Dandy himself. Now, Jim Dandy was, of course, he strutted across the stage, and they had a huge strobe light show with this act. And at the end, they used to smash their guitars together. Have any of y'all ever been to a rock concert, or have your kids been to the rock concerts and heard about this, along with the purple haze that hung over the building? Well, they would smash their guitars together. And Richard knew that this was part of the act, so he had been very careful after Sly's performance, and the kids were standing on the chairs, and they broke the chairs, and the place was just mayhem. So they built barriers to the stage that were made out of the stands for the chairs. They turned them on their edge and built barriers across the front of the stage so that the acts could perform and the audience couldn't get up on the stage. Well, they still crowded that barrier. And when they smashed those guitars together, a shard of one of the guitars went in the audience and hit a girl and split her forehead wide open. So Richard's standing on the floor, and he sees this happening, and he goes running over, dressed all in a suit and so forth. And they call 911, and the place is just mayhem. They're trying to clear the stage out. Richard goes up on the stage in his suit, looking all fancy. And everybody else is out there in their blue jeans and their tie-dyed shirts, you know. He doesn't look like them. He looks like the man. And so they paid no attention whatsoever to him. And he finally had to get the sound guy to come out and say, hey guys, you know, there's a chick up here with her head split open, get out of here. You know. So they finally left. Richard went to the hospital to see the girl. And this was the next day after they'd sewn her up and so forth. He was just panicked that she was going to sue the city and sue the city, the Civic Center and so forth. She said, no, Mr. Cobb, she said, if you could just do me one favor. I said, would you please bring me a piece of that guitar with my blood on it? Richard said, I don't think we can do that. But we will give you tickets to other concerts if you want to come. So, you know, Jim Dandy was not, shall we say, the favorite act that Richard had to deal with. But Elvis was. Elvis came to the building, and I don't know if you all know any of the lore of Colonel Tom Parker, who was his manager. But he was, shall we say, demanding and a little bit difficult to deal with. So when Colonel Tom Parker called, Richard really thought he was being pranked by one of his friends. He goes, you know, that's not Parker. So he goes, you know, hello. And guy says, Cobb, you want Elvis? And Richard goes, who is this? Well, it turned out it was Parker. And he wanted to book Elvis. But he had a specific way he was going to do it. He said, okay, we're going to book one concert. And if that sells out, then we'll book a second one. If that sells out, we'll book a third one. But that's the only way we're doing it. So Richard agreed. If you want Elvis, you do it Parker's way. So, of course, all three shows sold out, and people stood in line for hours getting tickets. They lined the Civic Center, went all the way down to Elk River, turned around and around the Shrine building. I mean, it was a mob scene out there, and they were there all night. One woman came, brought her newborn baby, and asked the security guards to warm the baby's bottle in the concession stand so that she could stand there in line to get tickets. One woman, swear to God, true, we verified these things in newspaper articles. I was beginning to think Richard was telling me a big one. One woman called and wanted to know if they would move out a row of seats so that she could bring in her daughter in an iron lung to watch this concert. Well, needless to say, he was accommodating, but not that accommodating. Just, you know, you can't take out permanent seats to do that. So they performed, and after the show was over on the last night, his manager, which, not Parker, but the stage manager, asked Richard if he would like to ride up to the airport with Elvis. And Richard says, yeah, he'd be glad to. So he got in the limousine, and this is when Elvis was a little older. And he was a little heavy and, you know, a little less sure of himself, shall we say. And Richard says that he used to say the whole time up there, how'd I do? How'd I do? Was I okay? Was I good? Was I okay? Did they like me? So forth. They got up there. Richard's imagining this private plane, right? Thinks he's going to have, you know, fancy girls and caviar and champagne and all this stuff. So he climbs on the plane, and Elvis has already gone ahead of him back to his bedroom. And he's sitting there kind of waiting around. Elvis comes out in a ratty chenille bathrobe and says, you want something to eat? And Richard said, yeah, sure. So he goes and reaches in the cabinet and reaches in the refrigerator, brings out 2 half pints of milk and 2 sleeves of Fig Newtons and tosses one set to Richard and takes the other food set. That's the fancy Elvis. I guess that's the Tupelo Elvis, not the one we ever see on stage. But he was a good guy. Richard was happy to have him there, weren't you? Yeah. So he left the Civic Center after he'd been there a couple of years. And he went to work for a company called Aerosmith, which is the food service vendor for most convention centers and sports arenas. And there he worked at the Spectrum in Philadelphia. And that time was when Van Halen was touring. And Van Halen is famous for no brown M&Ms. They had writers on their contracts saying what they wanted in the backstage rooms for snacks. And what he said was he wanted M&Ms, but no brown M&Ms. Now that sounds really arbitrary. But believe it or not, there was a legitimate reason for that. Had nothing to do with the M&Ms. It had to do with whether or not the building managers read the whole contract. Because often people didn't. They just, glossed over it. If you ever looked at a legal document, you know what I mean. It's not fun to read. So he would put that, buried it way down in the bottom of the contract, because above that were all the stipulations for the stage, and their equipment weighed 9 tons. And if you didn't have an adequate stage set, your stage would collapse and his stuff would be destroyed. And that's why he always said no M&Ms, but he put it way down at the bottom so that they were sure to read the whole contract. So Richard read it and set his staff to picking out the brown M&Ms. Yeah, amazing. He came back to Charleston then shortly after that and became the director. And that was the days when the Harlem Globetrotters were touring regularly. And they would bring a team with them called the Harlem Magicians. And that was the opposing team. And they were a bunch of people who could play basketball, but they weren't the pros like the Globetrotters were. And so one night they were apparently short a couple people, and they asked Richard if he knew anybody who could play basketball. And he said, well, yeah, I played basketball in high school and college, and my brother was, a good basketball player on the team. So they were conscripted, as you can see in this picture, to play basketball. And the guy in the middle is Marcus Haynes, and he was on the opposing team from the Globetrotters. And he was just as tricky as they were. And so they were playing basketball, and, Richard reaches for a ball that he thinks he's going to throw to him, and he flips it up behind his back, and he does all kinds of crazy stuff, and he completely bedazzled Will and Richard. It just made you look like nuts, didn't it? Yeah. Totally annihilated them when they were playing. But this was the kind of thing that went on. They had those kinds of events. They had, aside from all the concerts, they had 2 or 3 a week. They had people like the Ringling Brothers, Barnum and Bailey Circus. They had the Golden Gloves, and one night Richard had to push somebody back in the ring who fell out. Had Holiday on Ice, and a skating rink that was in there all the time, and several times the Zamboni, which is the thing that cleans the ice, broke down out in the middle of the ice, and there's nothing you can do with it because the ice is now going to melt. The thing's stuck in the ice till you can get it fixed. But they had, back then, do you remember Chicago, the band? It was originally called the Chicago Transit Authority, but eventually it was just shortened to Chicago. So he had a ticket manager named Kitty Myers who called him one day and said, Mr. Cobb, I think our phone number is mixed up with the bus stations. Richard goes, what? Huh? Why do you think that? She said, well, people keep calling here wanting tickets to Chicago. He said, no, Kitty, that's an act. You need to book them. You need to do that. So, one of the other things that they did while he was the manager was they brought Gerald Ford to Charleston. He was also involved with the Boy Scouts. And they were having a big Cub Scout induction dinner. They were trying to think of somebody who would really be a good speaker. And he and his friend John Wells' father had been real involved in the Scouts and was also real involved in the Republican Party. So he had been a delegate to the National Convention on many occasions. So he had many ways that he could get into the various ends with the Republican Party. And they wanted Gerald Ford to come. So Slim Wells was his name, although he was about this big. Slim got in touch with the Ford people, and they booked Gerald Ford to come. And he just happened to be at the same time that he was campaigning. I think this was in 75, maybe. And so he thought, well, that would be he could do 2 things at one time. He could campaign for the presidency, and he could speak to the Cub Scouts. So he came. So they had two rooms going. The campaign thing was in one hall, and the Cub Scouts were in another. They prepared this wonderful dish, Cornish hens, and they'd made up some dessert, some dessert with whipped cream and mayonnaise and fruit and all this kind of stuff called Almost Heaven. Well, the Secret Service men came in and put rectal thermometers in every single one of the Cornish hens to be sure that the temperature was accurate and that he wasn't going to get poisoned by bad food. Then they looked at those desserts and said those will not last through the dinner because they have mayonnaise in them. And he had to trash every one of those desserts and come up with something else to serve for dessert for that night. But he came, he made it. There's Richard in the background, blonde hair, turned inside to see your profile. That's you again. And Gerald is right here in the front speaking to somebody, and that's Arch Moore right behind him. But it was a big success. He would run from one hall to the other. He did his campaign thing, and then he ran over to the next hall and talked to the Cub Scouts. So it was a great event, and he left, the Secret Service people left a red telephone for Richard. And he had it for many years. I don't even know what happened to it, but he had this red telephone that was Gerald Ford's. You know, you hear all about the weird bands that came through civic centers and arenas and so forth, and there is no denying that they were weird. This is Alice Cooper on the Gerald, whatever, that song. He had this weird getup that he wore, you know, and he put boa constrictors that were not wide, but boa constrictors around his neck and all this kind of stuff. But Richard said he was a really gentle, sweet man when he was off the stage. He wasn't nuts like this. He was a big golfer, and he has endowed money to a number of organizations that have helped kids throughout the years. So he's a really nice guy, despite his on-stage persona. David Bowie was another one. He had, I don't know if you all remember him, but he always adopted different personas. He was, when he came to the Civic Center with Richard, he had this song that was called Colonel, somebody's going to have to remind me of the name, Colonel something to Earth, and he shot himself off into the atmosphere somehow with this rocket ship that he rode off the stage. Just, I mean, crazy looking stuff, big cityscapes, and every time he was there, it was a different persona. And then, of course, there's Kiss. Now, Kiss was famous, of course, for the flames, right? Well, one time that he was on stage, they blew this stuff, and he almost caught his own hair on fire. So you had to have all kinds of precautions with pyrotechnics when Kiss was in the building. And I don't know how he survived and looks as good as he does after all that he had to go through. It was, and this was like 2 and 3 nights a week he did this. It was every single time you turned around, there was another band in the building. He left there and went to Augusta, Georgia in 1976. Do y'all recognize who this is? Yes. This is Gunther Gebel Williams with the Ringling Brothers Circus. So Richard's primary duty in Augusta was to get the Civic Center built. They'd had an old auditorium called the Bell Auditorium, and they were expanding it and building all the way around it and incorporated the Bell, but it was much larger. And his biggest job was to get that thing opened, which was a political nightmare. There was all kinds of factions of fighting between the board of directors and the politicians in Augusta, and it really wore on Richard. It's one of the reasons I think he left, because it just got so contentious. But he finally got the building opened, and after having postponed it a couple of times, Ringling Brothers finally came. And Richard says he remembers that the night that this opened, he had his lions and tigers and leopards and bears and so forth all out there. And Gunther thought of himself not as an animal trainer, but he thought of himself as a friend of the animals, and he really made friends with them. He fed them, he groomed them. He didn't just go out there with a whip and take them through their paces. But this one night, this is not Simba was a lion or a tiger. Was Simba a tiger? Simba was a tiger. And he told Simba to sit. Now, you'll have to pardon my French on this one, okay? So Simba didn't sit. Simba was pacing around. Finally, Simba took a squat and went to the bathroom. And he yells, "I said sit, Simba, not shit." The whole audience could hear this, of course, and they just roared in laughter. I don't know whether it went downhill after that or not, but it was definitely a good opening. From Augusta, he went to Bangor, Maine. Now, talk about a change in scenery and a change in atmosphere and a change in weather. Augusta, Georgia sits on a river and it's humid and it's a lot like the Ohio Valley and only hotter. Then he goes to Maine, where he says that the seasons are 4th of July and winter. And that's the reason he didn't stay very long. He went up there thinking that he would be able to buy a big 4-wheel vehicle and get through the weather and so forth. Well, he got stuck in his own driveway, and they had to get a horse to pull out his own car. So the 4-wheel drive didn't survive. But his job there was to run a fairground, which had been there for years and years, harness racehorsing, carnival that would come yearly, and the events that went on in the building. They had a bad string of luck with concerts that had not done well, and Richard was convinced that with enough promotion and so forth, they could bring concerts in. Or the kids had broken in, they'd not paid, there had been riots and all kinds of stuff. So he managed to calm all that down and get the system under control so that they could have concerts. But 2 years, was it 2 years in Bangor? 2 years of winter was enough for him. So he came back to West Virginia. And he came to Huntington, which is where I met him. And he was running the Huntington Civic Center. Now that Civic Center was about 8,000 people, not 10 like Charleston. So it didn't book as many concerts. But the ones that they did book were usually pretty successful. However, Ozzy had a really bad reputation, almost as bad, if not worse, than Sly's, for eating the heads off bats, tearing up baby dolls, all of this kind of stuff. Now, it is true he did bite the head off of a live bat once, but he didn't know it was a live bat. Somebody threw it on stage, and he thought that it was a toy bat, and he bit the thing. And he ended up having to get shots for rabies because of that. So these were, purely stage theatrics. So nevertheless, we had a preacher in Huntington named Jim Franklin who was extremely conservative. And he insisted that Ozzy not come. I mean, he raised all sorts of stink, wrote letters to the paper, went to city council. I mean, it was just on and on and on. And finally, Richard said, all right, I'll go preview one of his concerts and see if he behaves, because he'd heard that he was dialing it down a little bit. So he went to Syracuse, New York to preview this concert. And he was driving a diesel car, which froze over while he was there. So they had to tow it inside till it could thaw out. But he went over to Ozzy, and Ozzy said, he tried to explain to him, he said, Huntington is in the cradle of the Bible Belt, right in the buckle. So you got to dial it down. You got to behave yourself. Oh, Mr. Cobb, he said, I wouldn't do anything to embarrass you. I wouldn't dream of doing anything to embarrass you. I will behave. I'll tone it down. I'll just be so good. Well, so he booked him, and the city council said, okay. The manager said, okay. So he booked him. And as you can see, it didn't go well, because the preacher mounted a huge protest out front. Now, ticket sales had been moderate, but when the protest showed up, people decided, I'm going to protest that. So they bought more tickets. So the thing was sold out. It was a really good show. But Ozzy did not stand true to his word. He came out on stage and he goes, hello, Huntington, West Virginia. Let's get effing crazy. and the place just roared, erupted into just screams and cries and hollers and laughter. And it went downhill from there. He bit heads off of baby bats. He tore up doll babies. He did everything that he had ever said he would not do. And Richard took a whole lot of heat over that one. But, you trust somebody when they say they're going to do it. You have to trust them. And, of course, he didn't. He didn't. There were all kinds of fallout from that. So after Huntington and Ozzy and a few other incidents, he went to Columbus, Georgia. There's Ozzy acting like a complete screwball. Now, Columbus, Georgia was a really different situation, and I went to work for Richard down there. And this was an old Confederate armament factory. They had built cannons in there, and the ceilings were, what would you say, 60 feet tall? I mean, they were huge. Solid brick floors in most of the building, beams that were original beams built back in the 1800s. This place was beautiful. And it had been renovated completely and turned into a convention center. And that's what it had a reputation for being, was a convention center. And so the state had done a good job, and the Convention and Visitors Bureau had done a good job of promoting that building, but the locals didn't use it very much. So Richard hired me to come to Georgia to be the marketing director of that building. So we created events that would bring people in locally. Things like a Taste of Columbus, which was a food tasting event, which had 40 restaurants, and you bought samples of foods and so forth. I'm sure some of you all have heard of those in other places. We did a medieval fair, an ironworks medieval fair, a Renaissance festival, which probably was our downfall, because we did it after 3 years of a drought in Columbus in June. And we set it for June, and it was outside as well as inside. And the building had attached to it a long park, kind of. And we had the joust field out there. We brought in live jousters, fencers, mud wrestlers, a king and queen, elephant rides, all sorts of things. We had food vendors and craft vendors all over this this wide park and so forth. And it opened like at 2 o'clock on a Friday afternoon, and we're out there walking around, and at 2:30 the skies opened. And it rained for 2 solid days. It knocked down all of the stage backs, the scenery, flooded the electrical lines. I mean, we just had to close up. There's just nothing you could do. I mean, I had hitched up my medieval dress and was stomping around in mud puddles like this. We moved it inside on Sunday, and we continued, but we lost a lot of money, like $50,000, $53,000. They weren't happy with us, shall we say, because we had taken a big risk. And that's the thing with Richard. Richard was always an idealist and a big risk taker. And he was willing to see what he could do to improve the building and bring people in. And sometimes it got him into trouble, but most times we did succeed. So this was a beautiful building, but he also had, this was the success story, he had a local promoter there who would bring in some bands. And back then, he had a small venue that was like a restaurant, bar kind of place, and he would bring acts to there. But this trade center, this really big hall you're looking at, that's called the South Hall, was much bigger, would hold a whole lot more people. So his name was Mike Blackwell. So Mike made a deal with Richard that he would pay a flat fee and Richard would get the bar. So rather than him getting part of the ticket sales. So we would set up bars all across the back of the building. And one year he had this was right on the border between Georgia and Alabama. And Auburn was only 30 miles away. So Georgia's University, State University of Georgia, always played Auburn every year. So it was the Georgia-Auburn game. So they would alternate. 1 year would be at Auburn, 1 year would be at Georgia, which is up in Athens. This was the year that it was in Auburn, and they had a band booked, but the band was late. So everybody had come from the game 30 minutes after the game, and the place was packed. So what do you do while you wait for the band? You drink beer, right? We made $25,000 on the bar alone, and Mike Blackwell had paid maybe $2,500 to rent the building. So we came out smelling like roses that day. You know, that helped make up for the loss on the medieval fair. But one time he did book the band himself. Into the building came two promoters, swore that they worked for the OJs. Do y'all remember the name of the OJs? So they booked this band, and they were going to play some night, I think it was on a Memorial Day weekend. Well, we got the band that was playing as their warm-up band on and off the stage, and the OJs hadn't shown up. So we sent somebody across the street to the Hilton Hotel to say, we've never actually seen the band. And those promoters left about 2 hours ago with a big old Cadillac. So here we are with a whole room of people, this great big hall, sitting there waiting for the OJs who are not coming. And probably never were in town, to tell you the truth. These two guys probably were not their managers, were not their bookers, and had booked out of town with our money. $5,000? Yeah, $5,000. Richard had given them, and this is rare, he'd never done this before, but they insisted that he had to have it for travel expenses. So he gave them the box office. All right, now the concert has to be canceled, and it's Memorial Day weekend. And there's no way to give the money back to the people who are sitting there in the audience. So he had to go up on the stage and give them, make them understand that he would honor his business card as a refund for their tickets if they would wait until next Tuesday. This is a Saturday before Memorial Day. So banks are closed, cities closed down. So he couldn't get the money from the city until the following Tuesday morning. Now, he's a white guy, and the audience is primarily black. So he's standing up there, and he gets his operations director, Bruce, to go up on stage and say, you know, introduce Richard and say, he's a good guy, he's going to do what he says he's going to do, trust him. So Richard handed out his business cards, and the next Tuesday, they all lined up to get their money back. It was hotter than blazes, so he put out big coolers of Pepsi and Coke and soft drinks and so forth for the people standing in line. And after he had begged the city, please, to give him back $5,000 out of their coffers, he was able to give the money back to all these people. So after that, he went to Gatlinburg, Tennessee, where again his job was to build a brand new building around an old one. This is the entrance. If y'all, has anybody been to Gatlinburg? Yeah. Well, this is right on, is that called Parkway? I think it is Parkway. And the old building is around on the street that goes up the hill. So he had to build this whole new building and open it up. But after, what was it, maybe 3 years you were in Gatlinburg, he finally decided he had had enough of politics, boards of directors, and rock concerts. And he retired and became a realtor after that, which in my mind is a whole lot easier than what he had gone through for 25 years. He finally turned in, as they say, turned in his walkie-talkie. And you know, I think the reason that I wanted to write this book for Richard was not just to tell the funny stories, but to explain to people that what you used to see or what your kids saw out on that stage is really just the tip of the iceberg. And that what has to happen behind the scenes to get those people on the stage or off, as the case may be, is so difficult. And I don't think anybody ever recognizes how hard it is for the building managers and the staff to have to deal with all of that. And it is stressful. And while Richard still has blonde hair, I don't know why he does, but and hair, period. It's a hard job. And I think he did a brilliant job of it. So if you all have questions, I'm happy to answer them. I'll pop, if Richard wants to say something, he can pop in, but I'll be happy to answer questions from you all. No? Yes, right here.
So, did you all do something about the Jays? Did you sue them?
Well, we had to had to write up a very large report for the city to explain why we had to have $5,000 or $5,200 that they weren't going to get back. No, because I don't think those people actually ever worked for the OJs. The city tried, but we don't think that they ever did. I think we got basically snookered big time because we never could track those people down. We contacted the OJs and they had no knowledge whatsoever of ever hearing of Columbus, Georgia. So basically we were snookered. Yeah. Yes.
Just out of curiosity, you've talked about all the different places that your husband has been. And I was just wondering if you were with him, like in Gatlinburg, Huntington, and Charleston.
Not in Charleston. Richard and I met in Huntington when he was the Civic Center director, and I got hooked up with him in the business because in that time I was doing, I had my own business and I was creating events for nonprofit organizations, and they were being held in his building. So he hired me to run a craft festival. Also, in my life, in a previous life, I had been the director of a craft cooperative for 15 years. And so we'd been to a whole lot of events where I had to set things up. So he knew that I had that ability, and he hired me to run this festival that had kind of fallen down the tubes, and I revitalized it. And then when he moved to Columbus, he asked me to come down there and do the same thing for him. So I was with him in Columbus. He went to Gatlinburg. I did not, but I did do his grand opening in Gatlinburg. And then he retired, and he lived in Georgia, and I had moved back to Huntington. So it took us a few more years to get together to actually get married. But I've known him since 1984. So that's how I know his stories, because I've been listening to it for a long time. Somebody up here had a question. Yes.
Which event did you have that you appreciated the most?
Me, the one I had, probably the Taste of Columbus, because it was so successful. It was that I had only been in Columbus 10 weeks when we put that event on. I came in August, and it was in October. And people said, "Well, you can't do that." I said, "Watch." Well, there are not enough restaurants in Columbus that'll do this. I said, "Watch." So we went out and started going to restaurants and talking to them. And we got 40 restaurants to sign up. It was a 3-day event, and we had lots of people in there. We created coins that they used as money for the samples. We had promotions all over town. We gave prizes for the best booths. We had the People's Choice Awards, so that people chose what's the best food, the best restaurant, all this kind of stuff. And they're still proudly displayed in restaurants in Columbus, Georgia. So yeah, I was really proud of that event. And then he left, went to Gatlinburg. I stayed in Columbus for a couple more years, and I did it for a total of like 5 years. Now, what was the act you enjoyed the most? The act.
That I enjoyed.
Yeah, or that you're the most. What did you say? How did you phrase it? The best event that you ever dealt with. Probably Elvis. Yeah. I mean, you're not every day you get invited on the private plane to have fig Newtons and milk, right? Any other questions? Well, thank you all so very much. And we do have books for sale up here if anybody wants to hear all the gory details of the stories I've briefly told you. Thank you so much.